All right, so we're going to finally read this passage, and today we're continuing this series. We've been calling it A New Beginning. And each week we've looked at a different challenge, and today we're going to see the challenge of failure. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. By the way, it's one of the best stories in the Bible, especially if you like fishing, ever gone fishing, like the taste of fish, whatever. Anywhere that you fit into that, this is one of those great stories in the Bible. And so if you have one of the outlines and you want to follow along with me, we're gonna look at that. But we're going to begin reading in verse 1. It says in John 21, verse 1, "Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples." The word afterward there's a whole lot that's gone on before that, right? The whole ministry of Jesus, the whole teaching ministry of Jesus, the cross, the resurrection, all the appearances. A whole lot has gone on before that. Afterward. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. And it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus. By the way, that means he was a twin, if you don't know that. Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee. We know them as James and John. And two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. Isn't that a great line in the Bible? Just, "I'm going out to fish." Did you know that was in there? Next time somebody says to you, "Why are you going out to fish?" You say, "Well, that's in the Bible, you know." "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." Hey, that sounds fun. We're going to go fishing too. So they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. And he called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" That kind of must have felt a little insensitive, "No," they answered, and he said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat." Every time I read that, I kind of stop for a little bit and go, what were they thinking, right? Like, were they rolling their eyes like, who is this guy telling us to do this? Like, you're on the shore, we've been out in the boat, and you're telling us what to do? Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, the guy that wrote this down, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. And the other disciple followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish. Can you just see this? For they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." And Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, and he dragged the net ashore, and it was full of large fish. You know a fisherman's writing the story, right? These were big fish. 153. And a fisherman remember that number. But even with so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, I love this text, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and he took bread and he gave it to them and did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. As we look at this passage this morning, what we see in this story is really first and foremost a scene of failure. It is a scene of failure because, the story is about Peter, and Peter was the guy who had already denied Jesus 3 times, remember? And now as he goes out to go fishing, the professional fisherman goes out to fish all night. He doesn't catch anything. It is a story about failure. But then it is also a story about overcoming that failure as well. Do you realize that in our lives, if we're going to have a new beginning, as this series has been talking about, we're going to have to deal with the challenge of failure, the fear of failure, that failure is something that sort of paralyzes and keeps us from going forward. I read, as I was working on this commentary I was writing 2 years ago on the Fear Over Faith commentary, I was reading this story that had been in the news about a man who was in World War II, and he was in Yugoslavia. And he was he was kind of sympathetic with the Nazis. And so after the war, he hid out in his house for fear of being arrested. He didn't hide out in his house for a week or a month or a year. He hid out from the 1940s all the way up to the present day. And he'd been hiding out there his entire life. One day he was discovered, and this was the reason for the news story, because they went and he was so afraid he was going to be arrested, and they didn't even arrest him. They just said, it's been too long. And the story was kind of interesting because what came out of it was this. Here was a man who had been hiding out his entire life in this house for fear of something that actually never happened. And as I was reading that story, I was thinking, wow, isn't that a picture of some people's lives? So afraid of something that they're never willing to just step out. They're never willing to face the possibility of something, so they're just paralyzed in their fear. Failure and the fear of failure is one of those things that will do that to us. And if you got that outline, you want to kind of follow along. I just want to share with you kind of a few thoughts, a few notes along the way about that. These aren't really genius level comments. These aren't like really unbelievable insights. But they are life potentially changing insights. And the first one is this. As we face the possibility of failure in our life and that challenge of it, it's important to understand that fear of failure is often due to the desire of success, right? Okay, that's not genius level, right? Hey, what's the reason that we're afraid of failure? Because we want to succeed. But sometimes the fear of what happens if we don't succeed leaves us paralyzed. So what do? Peter had already denied Jesus 3 times. Peter had spent the entire night fishing, and he could have just said, forget it. The guy on the shore is telling me to cast the net on the other side, but I'm done. But he doesn't. He throws the net to the other side, and he catches all those fish. So what do we do in a moment like this? Like, what is this story really trying to teach us? Why is this even in the Bible? Well, I think there's a reason for it. I think the reason that Jesus allowed Peter to fail, first of all night long, and then to show up and for him to succeed, was that so for the rest of Peter's life, he could remember the moment when he could not succeed. But when Jesus showed up, he became successful. And that he could look back on that moment. Remember that morning. Remember that day when Jesus showed up, and that became the day of his success. And this is true of our lives as well. When we're facing the fear of failure due to the desire for success, here's what we should do. Reflect, like Peter, on our past victories. Reflect on those moments when God showed up and God helped us to get through it and to deal with it and to overcome it. I was reading about a painter, a famous American painter named John Sargent. And Sargent had spent his whole life painting, but he never felt like he was a good painter. And every time he would paint, he would say to himself, this isn't going to be any good, I can't do this. But early in his life, he had painted something that was so good, they showed it in art galleries and they tried to sell it for a good sum of money, but he decided to keep it. And somebody asked him, why do you keep that painting? You could have just sold it. He says, because this is why. He says, every time I start to paint and I feel like I am not going to be good at it, this is what I do. He said, I look at the painting and I say, I painted that. I did that. That one time I succeeded. That one time there was success. And that becomes the source of that inspiration to reflect back on those victories. Now, this moment is so interesting because we know a lot about Peter in the Bible, and we know one of the things about him is that he was a pro fisherman, right? If they would have had it back then, he would have been on the cover of, Sea Bass, Galilee magazine or whatever. It's just he was awesome, and he had he had a bass company. I mean, that's how he made money was as a fisherman. He was professional. In fact, that's actually where Jesus first met him. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, it says, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew, And they were doing the same thing, casting a net into the lake. For they were fishermen. That's what they were. They were pros. But we know something about this story, just like we know something about this story. This isn't a story about fish. It's not about the fish, is it? Because when Jesus continues to talk, when he calls Peter in that moment, this is what he says. This is the next two verses. Matthew 4:19. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. Or, the old translation would be fishers of men. And at once they left their nets and they followed him. Jesus wasn't talking to them about fish. He was talking about the gospel, the mission of God. So what do we learn from this story? When you fail, remember. When you fail, remember. This Wednesday night at the Civic Center, a best-selling author, longtime pastor, John Maxwell, will be in town. And he's written so many books on leadership. One of my favorite books, you always hear me talk about this, is his book called Failing Forward. I thought about that yesterday as some of us were at the skating rink for a birthday party, and my youngest Dash was trying out skating for the second time ever, and he was a little nervous, and I was a little nervous because I'm not that good either, and I'm supposed to hold him up. So I gave him this little piece of advice. I said, lean forward, right? Because if you fall, you'll fall forward on your hands. If you fall forward on your hands, you can get back up again. If you lean back, all bets are off, right? You may be there for a while. The image of failing forward to me is one that makes a lot of sense. And as I look at the story, say like of Peter versus Judas, right? Both failed. But one's failure was catastrophic, and the other propelled them on to become one of the greatest leaders in the early church. Peter could always remember his success on the shore of Galilee this day. But there's another thing at work here in this story. Because right at the very heart of everything going on in this story about failures is what happens in our life. When we fail, sometimes this is what we say. I am a failure. It's important to understand this, that sometimes our fear of failure is due to how we define our identity. Right? It's not just that I messed up. It's not just that I made a mistake. It's not just that I failed. It's that I am a failure. But that's not true. Go look at the stats for any of the great sports heroes. Go look at Michael Jordan, and you see the stats. And if you don't know better, you think he was an utter failure. But he was better than everybody else. Go look at the greatest baseball players that ever lived, and they struck out more times than they ever hit balls. We are not a failure because we fail. It doesn't define our identity. It's important in these moments to do something. We got to remember something else. Remember who you really are, right? Peter, you got to remember who you really are. You're not just a fisherman. You're a fisher of men. It doesn't matter if you don't catch some fish tonight, because I've got this bigger mission for you. I've got something more for you than this. And one night of failure is not going to define all of your life. I was trying to think of examples of people in the Bible who are defined by their identity and affected by their identity. In the Old Testament, nobody ever faced failure like the man Moses. First of all, Moses was born a nobody. He was the son of a slave in Egypt. And he was placed as a baby into the Nile River, almost as if to die. And then he was rescued by the court of Pharaoh. And he was taken into the court, and this Israelite slave, this Hebrew slave, is transformed into an official in the court of Egypt. He becomes a prince on the most powerful nation on the planet. It's an utter change of who he was. You couldn't imagine more of a rags to riches story than Moses. And then the next chapter in the story is he's a nobody. He's gone. He's out of Egypt. He's now like a Bedouin shepherd in the wilderness, having nobody to talk to but a bunch of sheep. And one day he walks up, he's so wanting to talk to somebody, there's a bush there on fire. And naturally, when you see a bush on fire, you just start talking to it, right? And he walks up to this, and this becomes the change moment of Moses' life. The call of God becomes on him, and he would, from that moment, lead Israel out of Egypt. But if you examine Exodus 3 and 4, you'll have to remember Moses' excuses. And there's a whole bunch of them. I just want to give you two of them as we think about this real quickly. One of the first things that Moses said to God at the burning bush is he said, "Who am I?" It's an identity question. Who am I to go to the Pharaoh of Egypt and say, "Let my people go"? Who am I to go into the court of the most powerful man on the planet and to tell him anything? Who am I? And by that he means I'm just the slave, the son of slaves. I'm just the shepherd, the son of shepherd. He doesn't mean I am the prince of Egypt in that moment. Who am I? I remember when you've heard my story about how God called me to the ministry in the fall in 1997. And right after that, I took a job as a youth minister, a student minister for about 7 months outside of Tyler, this little church. And after about 7 months, I realized God hadn't called me to student ministry. Surprised it took that long. But at the end of my time there, one Sunday night at church, they gave me a certificate that said, "You were called into the gospel ministry." And I remember after church, I walked across the way to the parsonage, and I remember looking up through those tall East Texas pine trees, and there was the big, beautiful, cool sky, stars, and I looked up there and I remember saying to God, "Who am I? Who am I that you would use me? Who am I?" That's the question we ask, isn't it? But it's often the excuse that we have. Well, God can't use me. But then here's the second question, the second excuse. Who are you, right? I just want to know who you are that's asking me to go to Pharaoh and to tell Pharaoh, by the way, his gods like Isis and Ra have defeated every other nation on the planet. You want me to go into his court and to tell him that this burning bush has told me to do all this stuff. Who are you to stand up to the gods of Egypt? Who are you? You see, this whole identity question is not just a question of who am I, but it's a question of how big my God is. Like, how can my God really do this? A new beginning is a moment in our life when we begin to ask, can God take us from failure to new beginnings? Can God be bigger than past mistakes? Can God create new opportunities? And it's important for Peter in this moment, after he's denied Jesus 3 times, to remember who he really is. But that's not all. Because the failure of Peter's life and the failure of our lives have one big thing in common. All failure is inevitable to a certain degree due to our common humanity, right? Due to the problem of being human. Most of us in this room are human. And the old saying is to be human, to err is human. There's a reciprocal relationship. If you think this week you're going to be perfect because you tried a little bit harder than last week, you're going to fail just like last week. Because failure is part of being human. Peter spent the whole night fishing. It didn't matter how good he was, how professional he was, how trained he was, how much he had been mentored by the great fishermen of old. He still couldn't catch anything until the master came and he said, "Try over there." It's not like it wasn't because he hadn't tried over there before, you know what I mean? It's because the master hadn't showed up yet. And this is an important lesson about failure. Don't be afraid to get help. I can't catch all the fish in the Sea of Galilee, but I know a God who can fill every net. You know, we all face things in life like Peter does here. I mean, can you just imagine all of the pain, the emotional pain that he was feeling on the inside, having denied Jesus and everything he was going through? This must have been, I sometimes think that Peter just went fishing because he just couldn't hardly deal with himself. I was reading about Abraham Lincoln. Some regard him as our greatest president. Something I didn't know about Lincoln. Turns out Lincoln lived most of his life with a very severe case of depression. At one point earlier in his life, his friends literally took away all of his knives and razors for fear that he might harm himself. Abraham Lincoln once said, "I am now the most miserable man living. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not." Okay, that's kind of like old King James to say, I don't think it's going to get any better. He was down in the dumps. Today, experts tell us that 1/5, you take a stone in this room, you hit 1 out of 5 people, suffer from an anxiety disorder called depression. My greatest preaching hero in the modern world is Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great British preacher, Baptist preacher. But everybody who knows anything about Charles Spurgeon knows that that great preacher suffered his entire life with incredible depression. Charles Spurgeon tried to help us understand what it felt like to have that depression. One time he said, "My spirits were sunken so low that I could weep by the hour like a child, and yet I knew not what I wept for." You know, I don't know where you are in life. I don't know what your humanity is bringing out of you today, but I just hope that whoever you are, wherever you are, that you're not afraid to get help. Do you know some of the great people in the Bible suffered with all kinds of different personal things? And sometimes the greatest lows of life come right after the greatest highs. In 1 Kings chapter 18, the great prophet Elijah had defeated the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. It was the greatest victory anybody had ever seen. The next chapter, he is running, hiding under a broom tree, wishing he was dead, and then they found him in a cave. The highs became the lows. You read the Psalms, and David in Psalm 69 talks about what he calls the pit. You talk about being down in the pits. The great king of Israel found himself often in the pit of his own emotions. Even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark's gospel tells us, was deeply distressed and troubled. Due to our humanity, don't be afraid to get help. And sometimes it comes in different forms. It could be, sometimes it's physical or physiological. I remember when I was in college, and I'd go like 2 or 3 nights without sleep studying for a final, and I'd say to somebody, "Boy, I really need to do something to make myself feel better." And somebody said, "Well, why don't you take a nap?" Sometimes our problems aren't huge. We just need to rest. Sometimes our problems are just physical or physiological. Sometimes our problems are mental. And I don't mean that like in a crazy sense. I mean, sometimes we just need clarity. We need education or information or somebody to say, "Let me help you understand this." Sometimes our problems are emotional. You know, one of the things I told in the early services, I said, one of the hardest things about being a preacher and preaching a sermon is that when I get up here and preach, I try to put all my emotions into it. And by the time I'm done, I'm just like, I'm worn out. And somebody said to me one day, said, "It's not like you're out there picking cotton or, out there working in the field. How can you say you're so tired at the end of the sermon?" And it's hard to describe it when you just put your emotion into something and you concentrate on something, you get tired. And sometimes we get tired emotionally in life. And sometimes we need a rest. Jesus would often rest. I tell my wife all the time, I say, I got to take a day off. And somewhere in the Bible, it seems like maybe one of the 10 Commandments said, 6 days shall a man labor, on the 7th he shall rest. It's really important for us to rest in life. It helps us recharge. Even Jesus took time and rested. It can also be spiritual, though. I had a pastor friend tell me one time, he says, sometimes in life you're depressed, and he says sometimes in life you're oppressed. And I had never thought about that before, but sometimes we just feel bad on the inside. But you know what? Sometimes it's because we're fighting a war on the outside. And there are spiritual things or other things that are happening around us in our life that are impacting us. And again, in our own humanity, don't be afraid to get help. There was Peter on the shore of Galilee. Thank God Jesus was there. I told you a few weeks ago about Eugene Peterson being on hospice. Eugene Peterson was the man who had translated the Bible in the translation called The Message. And he had done a lot of other things. He was a lifelong pastor. Eugene Peterson just died. Some of you saw in the news over the last week or so. His translation of this scene is one of the most beautiful in all of his translation. I want to read to you just part of it as he describes in his own words this scene. This is from the Message translation. When they got out of the boat, they saw a fire laid with fish and bread cooking on it. And Jesus said, "Bring some of your fish you've just caught." Simon Peter joined them and pulled the net ashore, 153 big fish. And even with all those fish, the net didn't rip. And Jesus said, I love this, "Breakfast is ready." In NIV it says, "Come and eat breakfast." But Peterson just tried to make it way we can all understand it. Hey folks, breakfast is ready. Well, Beth Moore, who knew Eugene Peterson and grieved his passing, made a comment. Some of you probably saw it. She said, "I imagine that when Eugene Peterson died, as he was taken right into the very presence of God, that Jesus was standing right there. And his statement to him was, 'Come and eat. Breakfast is ready.'" Would you pray with me?